Tonight, let's settle in and spend some time with the history of LGBTQ plus bookstores. Welcome back to Queer History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet time together, exploring another corner of LGBTQ plus history. Before we begin, if you enjoy cozy bedtime stories and LGBTQ plus history, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe. And if you enjoy tonight's story, I'll be back tomorrow night with the next episode in this series. Every episode on this channel is carefully researched, and you'll find the full source list for tonight's episode in the description below. Now, get comfortable, and let's begin. There is a particular feeling that comes from finding a book that sees you. Not a book that sort of gestures in your direction, or a book that includes a character who might, from a certain angle, remind you a little of yourself. Not the experience of reading a story and thinking, well, one element of this resembles something I've known, something closer and more specific than that. A book that actually sees you, a book whose sentences reach off the page and say, yes, I know what it is to feel this way. I know what it is to want what you want, and to be afraid of what you're afraid of, and to carry what you carry. I know the particular weight of your particular life, and I have put it into words. And here it is. Most people, at some point in their lives, have had that experience. The moment of recognition in a paragraph, the slight catch in the breath, the feeling of being surprised by a book, not by its plot, not by anything so external as that, but by its understanding of you. The quiet interior exhale that comes from being understood by something that cannot speak. You close the book, or you hold it for a moment without reading, and you feel, in the most private and unceremonious way possible, less alone. There is something almost physical about it, like a room that has been slightly too cold for a long time suddenly warming. But for a long time, for most of recorded history, really, that experience simply wasn't available to queer people in any ordinary or accessible way. The books that might have provided that recognition were hidden, or suppressed, or published in such small numbers and with such deliberate ambiguity that they barely rippled through the culture. They weren't stocked in the local library, at least not openly, at least not where a young person might stumble across them on a Tuesday afternoon with nothing in particular to do. They weren't displayed in the window of the corner bookshop, among the cookbooks and the mysteries and the biographies of presidents. They weren't recommended by teachers, or pressed into your hands by well-meaning relatives, or placed on the bestseller display near the door. They simply weren't there. Or if they were there, they were buried so deep, so far from the surface of everyday life, tucked behind categories that didn't name what they contained, that you would have had to know exactly what you were looking for before you could find them. And how do you know what you're looking for when no one has ever shown you that the thing exists? That question has been asked silently by an enormous number of people. Not out loud, usually. The asking itself would have required a vocabulary and a sense of permission that most people didn't have. It was more of a feeling than a question, a sense of looking at the world and not quite finding yourself in it, of reading book after book and never quite arriving at the moment of recognition, of beginning to wonder, half consciously, whether perhaps the problem is with you. Perhaps there is nothing to find because there is nothing to find because you are simply not the kind of person who gets to be in stories. Tonight's story is about what happened when a small group of people decided to change that. It's about the people who opened doors, literal glass-fronted doors on real streets in real cities, and said, "Come in. You belong here. We have been waiting for you." It's a story about bookstores, but it's also a story about space and safety and the quiet political act of being visible. It's a story about what it means to hold a physical place in the world, to plant a flag, not in the wilderness, but on a public street, in a storefront window, where anyone walking past can see it and know that this is here, that this exists, that people like us have built something that will not be moved. It's a story about paper and ink and handwritten notes tucked under the spines of books, about reading groups that met on rainy Thursday evenings and stayed too long, about bulletin boards covered so thoroughly in overlapping flyers that you could barely see the corkboard beneath, about booksellers who remembered your name and what you'd bought last time and what you might be ready for next. It's a story about court cases and legal briefs and lawyers and the particular courage of people who refused to accept that their right to sell and buy books was negotiable. About people who went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada to make the point. It's a story about AIDS bibliographies, printed and distributed in the early 1980s by booksellers who were not doctors, but who understood that the community needed information, and that nobody else was providing it. About the quiet heroism of showing up every day in the middle of a crisis and being there. It's a story about grief, the grief of watching institutions close, of watching the places that had held your history disappear, and about what happens after grief, about the people who decided that the closing of the old shops was not a conclusion, but a challenge, and began building again. And it's a story that is still being written right now, tonight, in cities across the world where people are opening their doors and saying, "Welcome. Come in. We have what you're looking for." Let's begin before the bookstores to really feel what LGBTQ plus bookstores meant, what they meant at the level of lived experience and collective psychology, at the level of the body and the heart and the quiet interior life of a person moving through the world. You have to spend some time with the world before they existed. And that world, for queer people, was largely lived underground. Not underground in a purely metaphorical sense, though there was plenty of metaphor to go around. The social and physical spaces where queer people gathered and found each other were almost always hidden from the general public. Hidden deliberately, carefully, strategically. They were tucked behind unmarked doors, down staircases, with no signs above them, in basements and back rooms, in the parts of town that polite society didn't bother to look too hard at, the blocks where the street lighting wasn't quite as good, and the businesses didn't advertise in the newspaper. The bar was the centre of queer community life for much of the 20th century. The bar, and to some extent, the bathhouse. These were the places where you could find other people like yourself, where you could relax, however slightly, and however conditionally, the constant vigilance that daily life required. They were deeply important spaces. They were, for countless people, the first proof they had ever encountered that they were not entirely alone. You walked into a bar, and there were other people there, and something in your chest shifted, not dramatically, but permanently. Something that had been clenched very slightly for a very long time came slightly, slightly loose. They were lifelines. There is no other word for it. For people who had grown up in small towns, or in religious families, or in communities where there was simply no language for who they were, the bar was the first place that offered a mirror. The first place that said, "You are not the only one," but they were also, and this matters enormously to the story we're telling tonight, hidden. Deliberately, carefully, necessarily hidden, often unmarked from the outside. There was no sign above the door that said what was inside. You found out about them through whisper networks, through a friend of a friend who knew someone who had heard about a place, through carefully circulated information that existed entirely off the record, passed mouth to ear, in lowered voices, in contexts where you were already sure enough of the other person to take the risk of saying what you knew. And the bars were policed, heavily, relentlessly, often brutally. In the United States and in Britain and across most of the Western world, it was, within living memory, illegal for establishments to serve alcohol to known homosexuals. Illegal, in some jurisdictions, for two people of the same sex to dance together. Police departments conducted regular raids on these establishments, and the people inside were arrested, and their names were sometimes published in the next morning's newspaper. And lives were upended, and careers were ended, and families were fractured. This was not ancient history. This was recent enough that the people who experienced it are, in many cases, still living. The texture of queer public life was one of concealment. The spaces existed behind closed doors and down unmarked staircases. They were interior spaces, windowless spaces in many cases, spaces designed so that whatever was happening inside could not be seen from the street. It was a survival strategy, and it worked, in the sense that it allowed community to form and persist even under conditions of serious and ongoing hostility. But it also meant that queer identity was, by the very architecture of its social spaces, something that belonged in the dark, something that turned its face away from the window. Books were their own particular territory, their own particular kind of longing. Words have always mattered enormously to people who feel themselves to be outside the mainstream of their culture. When your life isn't reflected in the world around you, in the television programs, in the films, in the conversation of your neighbors and co-workers, in the books assigned in school, you develop a particular hunger for the written word. You search for yourself in literature with a kind of desperate hope. You read everything, and you read between the lines of everything, and you become exquisitely attuned to the small hints and ambiguities and carefully placed absences that might signal that a book knows something about how you feel. You become a connoisseur of implication. You learn to read the novel for what it doesn't quite say, as much as for what it does. The impulse toward a more public, more accessible literature. The impulse that would eventually produce the queer bookshop was an impulse toward saying the thing more plainly, toward putting the books on the shelves, and the shelves in the window, and the window on the street, so that anyone who needed what the books contained could find them without having to know the code. This is the landscape into which the LGBTQ+ bookstore arrived. The year is 1967. America is changing rapidly and painfully in the way that significant change nearly always arrives. Not smoothly and according to plan, but in jolts and upheavals and collisions that feel, while they're happening, like more than any stable society should be able to absorb. Into this year, into this movement, 2 bookshops open. The first opens in March. San Francisco in the spring of 1967 is already one of the most interesting places in the world to be. 4 men, Hal Call, Bob Dameron, Robert Trollope, and Jack Tennyson, open the Adonis bookstore. They are entrepreneurs who have looked at the landscape of their community and seen a market, a real and underserved one. What the Adonis offers is physique magazines and pulp paperbacks and erotica, publications that had been circulating underground for years. The Adonis brings all of this into the light. It puts it on shelves. It opens a door and leaves it open. It is a commercial enterprise, not an activist one, and the distinction matters. There is something straightforwardly important in the idea that desire itself, not desire sanitized or intellectualized or apologized for, deserves a place in the commercial landscape of a city, deserves a storefront. But a different vision is unfolding in New York, 8 months later, in November of the same year. Craig Rodwell is 26 years old when he opens the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop. He has picked his name deliberately and with full awareness of what it means. Oscar Wilde, the Irish poet and playwright who became one of the most celebrated literary figures in the English-speaking world, and who was convicted of gross indecency in 1895 and sentenced to 2 years of hard labour, who died in Paris in 1900 in poverty and exile at 46 years old. To name your bookshop after Oscar Wilde in 1967 is to say something very specific. It is to say, we acknowledge our history. We know what has been done to us. We are building here in full knowledge of that history, and we are naming this place after someone who was destroyed for being what we are, and we are not going to be destroyed. Rodwell has strong ideas about what kind of history he wants to make. He does not want his bookshop to be a place of erotica. He wants something that lifts its head up into the daylight. The model he has in mind is the Christian Science reading room. Clean, well-lit, accessible public spaces where anyone could come in and sit down and read. He wants something like that for his community. The Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop opens at 291 Mercer Street in Greenwich Village, and it stocks no pornography. What it stocks instead is harder to find: novels and plays and poetry and political tracts and anything else Rodwell can locate that speaks to the reality of gay and lesbian life. Not in a basement, not behind an unmarked door, on the street, at street level, with a sign and a window and a door you can see from the sidewalk. In 1973, he moves the shop to 15 Christopher Street. The Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop, with its window facing outward onto the sidewalk of Christopher Street, becomes one of its landmarks. A fixed point. People walk past. People stop. People who have never seen anything like this before stand at the window and look in and feel something happen in their chests. In December 1970, 3 years after the Oscar Wilde opens, a man named Jearld Moldenhauer opens a bookshop in Toronto. He calls it Glad Day Bookshop. The name comes from a line by William Blake. A quality of joy asserted against difficulty, of brightness maintained in the face of darkness. It begins in a residential setting. Moldenhauer runs it out of his house on Seaton Street, a quiet domestic space where customers come by appointment to browse a collection of books they could not find anywhere else in the city. As we sit here tonight, Glad Day Bookshop is still open. It is the oldest surviving LGBTQ plus bookshop in the world. Started in a house on a quiet Toronto street in December 1970 by a man with a collection of books and a belief that his community deserved a place to find them. Still here, more than 50 years later. Still holding the door open. Also in 1970, in Minneapolis, 2 women, Rosina, Richter Christie and Julie Morsequist, are part of a collective household, a women's cooperative commune. And out of that collective house, the Amazon Bookstore Cooperative is born. Its philosophy is clear from the beginning. This is a space for women, for lesbian women, for feminist women, for women who have looked at the literary landscape of the early 1970s and found themselves invisible. 4 bookshops, then, by the end of 1970. 4 different visions of what a queer or feminist bookshop could be. A commercial enterprise in San Francisco, an activist reading room in New York, a survivor in Toronto, a collective in Minneapolis, all of them pointing toward the same thing. The idea that queer and feminist people deserved a place in the public landscape of their cities. A real place, a visible place, not a back room and not a basement. A place with a door you could open in the daytime without looking over your shoulder. I want you to imagine now that you are walking into a queer bookshop, not rushing, not skimming through on your way somewhere else, really walking in on an ordinary afternoon with nowhere particular to be and nothing particular in mind, just the decision to open the door and see what's inside. The door is glass, and as you push it open, you feel the slight resistance of it, the familiar weight of a door that has been opened many, many times before. A small bell might chime above your head, or perhaps there's no bell at all, just the sudden quiet of an interior space, the muffled shift from street noise to something softer. The door swings closed behind you, and the city is on the other side of the glass. The air is different inside. It always is in a bookshop. There's that smell, not just paper and ink, but something older and more complex. The warm, accumulated presence of all the hours that people have spent in this room. The shelves are everywhere. They don't have the corporate symmetry of a chain bookshop. These shelves have grown organically, added to and rearranged over the years. There are handwritten signs, small cards tucked under the spines of books, in someone's actual handwriting. A staff recommendation, a note about why this book is here, a quiet piece of literary advocacy. This is what the bookseller thinks you should read. Not an algorithm. A person. Giovanni's Room began its life in Philadelphia in the early 1970s. 3 men, Bern Boyle, Tom Wilson Weinberg, and Dan Sherbo, find a low-rent storefront at 232 South Street and decide that Philadelphia needs a gay bookshop. They go to New York to buy their initial stock. They walk the aisles of wholesalers and choose books. Fewer than 100 titles in the beginning, hand-picked one by one, bought with cash, carried back to Philadelphia. In 1975 and 1976, a woman named Pat Hill takes over the stewardship of the shop. She is a Quaker and an artist and an activist. Under her guidance, the lesbian and feminist sections grow, and Pat Hill introduces events. The events were called Wine, Women, and Song, evenings that brought people together, not just to shop, but to gather, to talk, to hear each other. A bookshop can do something that other kinds of shops cannot. A pharmacy sells you what you need, and you go home. But a bookshop can also be a room where people sit together and listen and talk and find each other. In 1976, Ed Hermans and Arlene Olshan take over Giovanni's room. They will run it together for nearly 4 decades, nearly 40 years. While the whole shape of the world changes around them, they are behind the counter of Giovanni's room. In 1979, they moved to 12th and Pine in Philadelphia's Gayborhood. By 1986, Giovanni's room expands into the neighboring building. It becomes, in time, not just the largest LGBT bookshop in the United States, but a genuinely international institution. It begins exporting American queer titles to Europe, to Australia, to New Zealand. Lambda Rising, in Washington, D.C., opened in 1974, founded by Deacon McCubbin, and established itself quickly as one of the central institutions of D.C.'s queer community. Large, well-stocked, active, present, and crucially, sober. A bookshop was what sociologists call a third space, a term for any space that is neither home nor work, a place where you can be in public without being on the street, where you can be among people without being in a social situation that requires constant performance. For people who were newly out, the bookshop was often the first community space they encountered. For people who were shy, the bookshop offered a way into the community that didn't require performance. For people in recovery, the bookshop offered community without alcohol. For younger people who weren't old enough to go to bars, the bookshop might be the only queer community space they could access. The bookshop was available to everyone. The door was open during the day. The window was visible from the street. You didn't need anyone's permission to come in. In London, in 1978, a bookshop called Sisterite opens in Islington with its Sisterbite Cafe inside. In 1984, Silver Moon opens on Charing Cross Road, the historic heart of London's book trade. To open a feminist bookshop on Charing Cross Road is to plant a flag in the very centre of literary tradition. In Berlin, Prince Eisenhardt's Buchladen opens in 1978, growing from the radicalism of the German student movement. It will eventually establish the Teddy Award, a prize for films at the Berlin International Film Festival with LGBTQ+ themes. All of these shops, in all of these cities, are connected to each other. They share publishers and distributors. The booksellers correspond with each other. They exchange recommendations and intelligence. They pass information about legal threats and community needs. They share a sense of being part of something larger than their individual shops. A network, a movement, a collective project being built simultaneously in multiple cities on multiple continents. The bulletin boards. Every queer bookshop of this era had bulletin boards, and the bulletin boards were as important as the books. They were the nervous system of the community, the place where information lived and spread. Covered in flyers, overlapping, slightly tattered, some of them weeks old and some of them just put up that morning. Meetings of support groups, housing notices, announcements for political organising events, information about health resources, details of reading groups, invitations to marches and rallies and vigils. The bulletin board was the social media of its day, except that it was physical and local and specific to this community, in this city, on this block. You couldn't see it from anywhere else. You had to come here, in person, and stand in front of it, and read it. Now, I want to spend some time with Deacon McCubbin. He changed his name. He chose deacon because it spoke to the kind of role he saw himself playing in his community. A deacon is a servant of the church, not the minister, not the pastor. A deacon is the person who enables the community's life, who ensures that the things that need to happen happen, who serves without requiring the recognition that the person at the front receives. In 1975, Lambda Rising airs the world's first gay-oriented television commercial. Think about that for a moment. 1975. Television is a mass medium in the fullest sense. 3 major networks, most American homes with 1 television in the living room. And in 1975, gay identity is still highly controversial as a subject of public discussion. The American Psychiatric Association had only removed homosexuality from its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1973. Into this landscape, McCubbin puts a television advertisement for a gay bookshop. The advertisement doesn't argue for anything. It just announces a business, the way all advertisements announce businesses. But the fact that this particular business is announcing itself on television makes the advertisement itself into an argument about normality, about the reality of queer community, about the right to exist in the mainstream of public life. Then, in 1987, McCubbin launches the Lambda Rising Book Report, a regularly published catalogue of books relevant to LGBTQ+ readers, organized and annotated and distributed widely. In an era before the internet, a catalogue like this is enormously useful. It gives names to things that people have been searching for without knowing how to search. It reaches people who have no queer bookshop in their city, in isolated communities, in small towns. And then, in 1989, the Lambda Literary Awards. The Lammies. Literary prizes work in a specific way. They single out specific books and say, this one. And that act of recognition creates a cultural event. The Lambda Literary Awards say, formally and publicly and repeatedly, year after year, that queer writing deserves to be evaluated and celebrated and recognized as literature. Full stop. By the early 1980s, the LGBTQ+ community had built, from almost nothing, in roughly 15 years, a network of organizations and businesses and cultural institutions that constituted something like a real infrastructure. And then, AIDS arrived. AIDS arrived in the early 1980s, without a name, without a known cause, without a treatment, and without anything like an adequate response from the government or the medical establishment. The Reagan administration's response to AIDS in the early and middle 1980s was one of near total negligence. The silence was not passive. It was active. It was a choice. The bookshops stepped into this gap. Giovanni's Room in Philadelphia began publishing annual AIDS bibliographies, lists, organized, printed, distributed, of every book and pamphlet and piece of medical literature they could locate on the subject. At a time when the city's official health services were offering very little, Giovanni's Room became an information resource. They distributed safe sex pamphlets. They maintained files of relevant medical and legal information. They were not a medical organization. They were a bookshop, run by booksellers. But they understood their community. They understood what the community needed and what was not being provided. And they helped. In Edinburgh, a bookshop called Lavender Menace, named with characteristically queer irony, after the phrase Betty Friedan, had used to describe the lesbian presence in the feminist movement, turning an insult into a badge of pride, found itself in the 1980s producing specialized bibliographies and becoming an information resource. Trying to provide, in the words of one account, sane, welcoming environments at a time when the broader social environment was characterized by panic and misinformation. The trust that made the AIDS response possible was built before the AIDS crisis arrived. It was built every time a bookseller remembered a customer's name, every time an event brought people into the room together, every time the shop was simply there when someone needed it. There was also, in the 1980s, a legal battle. In April 1984, in London, customs officers and police conduct a raid on a bookshop called Gay's the Word, a beloved Bloomsbury institution serving London's queer community since 1979. Under Operation Tiger, customs officers and police seized thousands of books and other materials. The shop's directors are arrested and charged with conspiracy to import obscene material. But the community responds. Benefit events are organized. Fundraisers are held. People who have never been to Gay's the Word donate money to its defense, because they understand that what is being attacked is not just one bookshop, but the principle of queer cultural life in public space. In 1986, the charges are dropped. Gay's, the Word survives. In Canada, Glad Day Bookshop in Toronto becomes the centre of a legal case in 1987 involving a book called The Joy of Gay Sex. The judge who hears the case makes a comparison remarkable in its clarity. That omitting this material from a serious account of gay experience would be like omitting Mozart from a history of music. Glad Day wins. Little Sister's book and art emporium in Vancouver, British Columbia, begins its own legal journey in March 1990. What becomes clear is that Canadian customs authorities are not applying the law neutrally. Materials allowed into Canada for mainstream bookshops are being seized when destined for Little Sisters. Little Sisters fights through the courts for a decade. Their case eventually reaches the Supreme Court of Canada. In 2000, the Supreme Court rules, condemning the systemic border harassment, shifting the burden of proving obscenity from the bookshop to the state. These people went to court. They spent money they didn't easily have. They spent years of their lives in legal proceedings. They did it because they understood that what was at stake was not just their particular bookshops, but the principle of queer cultural life in public space. Then comes the mid-1990s, and everything changes again. The change arrives not as a dramatic event, but as a slow accumulation, a gradual alteration in the conditions that have made the queer bookshops possible. Not a raid, not a legal battle, not a public crisis with a visible opponent. Something more diffuse and more difficult to resist, precisely because it is not obvious and not dramatic. It is 1995. Amazon.com launches. The idea of buying books online, sitting at a computer and ordering from a catalogue of virtually unlimited size without setting foot in a shop, without talking to a bookseller, without going anywhere at all, becomes real for ordinary people. The effects on independent bookshops are devastating. Not immediately, not overnight. In the first years after Amazon's launch, the LGBTQ plus bookshops are still there, still open, still serving their communities. The change is gradual enough that you can almost not see it while it's happening. You can convince yourself that it's going to stabilize, that people will continue to want what the physical shops offer, that the things Amazon cannot provide will prove to be irreplaceable. But the pressures are building. Customers who have been coming in for years for a specific title start ordering online instead. The economic model starts to crack, not all at once, in pieces. The problem is that what these shops offered was never just access to books. The rest of it was everything we've been talking about all evening. The community space, the bulletin board, the bookseller who knew you, the reading groups, the events, the safe atmosphere, the visible statement of existence. None of that transferred to a website. You can go to Amazon.com and find a vast selection of queer literature. What it cannot provide is the experience of being somewhere, of walking through a door into a room that knows who you are. In 1999, the Amazon Bookstore Cooperative in Minneapolis, which had been operating for almost 30 years, sued Jeff Bezos and Amazon.com for trademark infringement. Their name, after all, predated his by more than 2 decades. The lawsuit was settled, including a modest cash settlement. A small victory and a slightly hollow one. In 2012, more than 4 decades after it first opened its doors in a collective household in Minneapolis, the Amazon Bookstore Cooperative closed. What does it feel like to close a shop that has been part of a community's life for 4 decades? The last day, the empty shelves, the removal of the signs, the handwritten cards tucked under the spines of books, someone's actual handwriting, years and years of small acts of literary advocacy. Where do those go? The bulletin board, its thumbtacks, and its curling flyers, dismantled at last. Lambda. Rising in Washington. DC closed in 2009. A Different Light closed its stores one by one. Giovanni's Room closed its doors in 2014. The things that were lost were specific and not interchangeable. The specific collection that Giovanni's Room had assembled over 4 decades cannot be reconstituted elsewhere. The specific knowledge that Ed Hermans and Arlene Olshan had built up over nearly 40 years of knowing their community and their stock. That knowledge lived in them and in the relationships they had built, and it doesn't transfer to a website. In 2009, Deacon McCubbin said something that seemed, at first, like it might be true. He said that because mainstream bookshops now stocked LGBT titles, the specialty shops had fulfilled their purpose. They had succeeded. Mission accomplished. But the mission accomplished framing turned out to be wrong about 3 important things. Walk into a Barnes & Noble and try to find the bulletin board. It's not there. Walk into a Barnes & Noble and try to have a conversation with a bookseller who knows the stock deeply and knows the queer community specifically. That person probably isn't there. Walk into a Barnes & Noble looking for the small press publications, the debut novels by unknown authors, the poetry collections that sell 2,000 copies and are enormously important to the people they reach. The mainstream bookshop carries what sells in sufficient quantities to justify shelf space in a corporate environment. The specialty shop carries what matters to the community it serves. And walk into a Barnes & Noble looking for the experience of being in a physical space organized around your existence, looking for the sanctuary. That experience doesn't transfer to the mainstream. It cannot. The grief of watching these shops close was real and appropriate. The grief was evidence of something, evidence of what these places meant, of what was being lost. You don't grieve the closing of a neutral commercial space in the same way. You Don't organise benefit events and fundraisers when a chain store closes. The grief and the organising were themselves testimony to what these shops had always been. They were something more than retail. They were infrastructure. They were sanctuary. But the story doesn't end with loss. Loss is part of the story. The closures were real, and the grief was real, and the change in the landscape was real. But the story doesn't end there. There is a resurgence happening. Right now, in cities across the United States and around the world, queer bookshops are opening. New ones. Not the same as the old ones, because the context is different, and the people are different, and the conversations that are shaping them have moved forward, but inspired by the tradition, carrying its lessons forward, building on what the earlier shops understood about what a queer bookshop is for. They are opening because the digital landscape has revealed its limitations, because the internet, for all its genuine capacities, cannot provide what a physical room provides. Because the younger generation of queer people, who have grown up with the internet and understand its possibilities more fluently than any previous generation, are also aware of its insufficiencies, of the things it can't give you, of the continuing need for physical space, for room in the world that belongs to you. In Washington, D.C., Loyalty Bookstores has established itself as one of the most thoughtful, independent bookshops in the country. Co-owned by Hannah Oliver Depp and Christine Bollo, Loyalty operates with a clear commitment to the voices that the mainstream continues to underserve, a specific, intentional focus on BIPOC writers and disabled perspectives. In Brooklyn, the Non-Binarian is a queer bookshop collective that is trans-owned, disabled-owned, and Asian-owned. And it began not as a bricks-and-mortar store, but as a book bike. A bicycle with books on it, travelling through the neighbourhood of Crown Heights in Brooklyn, bringing queer and trans literature directly to people in public spaces, not waiting for people to find their way to a shop. Going to where people are. In Salt Lake City, Utah, Under the Umbrella, operates as a sober, safe space for queer youth who are not old enough to drink, or who are in recovery, or who simply don't want the bar to be the only social option available. In Salt Lake City, for a young queer person, the options may be quite limited. Under the Umbrella may be the only accessible queer community space they have. In Asheville, North Carolina, Firestorm Books operates as a radical worker cooperative, explicitly committed to mutual aid and social movement support. And in Manhattan, the Bureau of General Services. Queer Division faced closure, and the community responded. A fundraising effort was launched. Within 2 weeks, $50,000 had been raised, then $75,000. People who had never set foot in the shop donated. People who had bought their first queer book there donated. People who had long since moved away donated. That rapid, generous, community-led response is evidence. It is data about what these institutions mean to the people who depend on them. The speed of it, the generosity of it, the community saying, "This matters. We know it matters. We will not let it go without a fight." What are queer bookshops for? What have they always been for? The simple answer is, they sell books. They provide access to literature that speaks to queer experience, literature that allows people to see their own lives reflected back to them and to feel the particular, irreplaceable relief of being understood. But the more complicated answer has to do with space. with the quiet but profound political significance of taking up space, with what it means in a world that has historically tried to push queer people into the margins, to occupy a room on a public street and say, "This is here, and it is for us, and we are not going anywhere." The queer bookshop has also been, repeatedly, throughout its history, a substitute for institutions that failed. When the government suppressed medical information about AIDS, the bookshops distributed the information. When the legal system tried to define queer culture as obscene, the bookshops went to court. When the mainstream publishing industry ignored voices that didn't fit its commercial template, the bookshops carried those voices. And then there is the sanctuary, the physical sanctuary of a dedicated space. This is the thing that Amazon cannot provide. This is the thing that the mainstream bookshop cannot provide. The need is for presence, for the experience of being in a room where you belong. I think about Craig Rodwell opening his shop on Mercer Street in November 1967, wanting to build not just a shop, but a reading room, a community headquarters, a place where his community could see itself reflected in the full light of day, turning the lights on and opening the door. I think about Jearld. Moldenhauer in Toronto, opening Glad Day from his house on Seaton Street in December 1970, keeping it going through raids and legal battles and economic upheavals, and 5 decades of social change. Glad Day is still open. I think about Ed Hermans and Arlene Olshan, running Giovanni's Room together for nearly 40 years, publishing AIDS bibliographies when the government was silent, exporting books to Melbourne and London and Auckland. I think about the bulletin boards, covered in flyers for meetings and housing and support groups and political events, the thumbtacks slightly worn from years of use, the paper curling at the edges of the oldest ones, the low-tech, high-value infrastructure of community life. The deepest act, the most fundamental and irreplaceable act, was simply keeping the doors open, showing up every day and unlocking the door and turning on the lights and being there for whoever walked in, especially in the years when it was hard. Keeping the doors open then. The history of LGBTQ plus bookstores is, at its core, the history of a community deciding that it deserves to be visible. The window, facing the street. In November 1967, in New York City, a young man named Craig Rodwell turns on the lights in a small shop on Mercer Street in Greenwich Village, and the light comes through the glass, and anyone walking past on the sidewalk outside can look in and see it. A bookshop, on a public street, organized around their existence, the book in your hands, pulled from a shelf that was built for you, by people who believed that your life was worth a book, that your experience was worth a story. The bookseller who looks up when you come in, who says, "Welcome, take your time, we're glad you're here." The door, opening. The quiet shift from street noise to something softer. The warm air of a room full of books. Come in, you belong here. Good night. The full source list for tonight's episode is in the description below. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like this video and subscribe to Queer History for sleep. And I'll see you tomorrow night. Sleep well.